gonna give it a 5. Boo, 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 boo. No. God, I'm kind of dreading talking about this one. Scott, okay, Sam, jeez. There's quite literally no one asking me to do this, and there might be some people who are actively wishing that I would stop, but I'm not going to. So today I'm going to tell you about all the books that I read in April. I ended up reading 14, so big nerd. You can tell how much I'm really trying to procrastinate on writing my thesis. Okay, so the first book that I read was The Ruins by Scott Smith, and this is a book I read in my California travel reading blog. If you're interested in hearing a little bit more about my thoughts as I'm reading it. For those of you who don't know what this is about a group of friends who end up at the site of these Aztec ruins in Mexico while they're on vacation, and they end up getting trapped in these ruins and sort of descending into horror. So I had originally seen the 2008 film and loved it, so I was going into this pretty hopeful that I would like it, but I ended up liking it way more than I even originally thought I would. A unique aspect of this book is that it has no chapters, so it really made it feel like it had a page-turning pace, because there were no points where it felt like, okay, this is where I can leave off. It was just like, okay, we're just gonna keep going. At its core, this is a survival horror story with a lot of body horror and then psychological horror that is sort of born from that. There's, some really fantastic body horror, and I really enjoyed that the psychological horror took the reader along the whole time. So even though there aren't any chapters, there's like long paragraphs, and each paragraph it switches perspective to a new character. So you sort of get a glimpse into the psyche of each character and how being forced to survive is affecting each of them individually. There's one character who ends up descending into insanity a little more quickly than the others. So as you're reading about this character, you're like, okay, they're just going crazy. But then as it keeps switching perspectives and then you finally get from their perspective, it's like, oh wait, maybe that's not the full story, maybe they're not crazy. And then I just really liked it because it kept me on my toes and really kept me guessing. And I think the fact that it switches perspective, you would think that would potentially make it confusing, but I don't think it made it confusing. I think it served to really help build the tension. Because a lot of times the, paragraph from someone's perspective would end and it would be like them reacting to something, but you wouldn't know what they were reacting to yet. And then it would switch perspectives and then start out like with that character seeing what's happening. So you would almost like know something was going to happen or something was happening, but you didn't know what. And then it was just like so tense because everyone else was reacting and like so horrified. So you were just waiting to see like, what's happening, If you saw and enjoyed the film, I would say you should definitely read the book. I guess even if you didn't enjoy the film, you might still enjoy the book because there were quite a few divergences in the story. The divergences lead to different endings, but I think that each ending is equally good. So I really like the movie storyline because I think what was added that wasn't in the book really added to the story, but then I think the parts of the book that weren't in the movie and it like worked really well in the book. So I think you should read the book. I would love to hear which you guys thought was better because I honestly have a hard time deciding, but I freaking love this book. It was shocking, it was twisted, it was realistic. So I ended up giving it 4.5 out of 5 stars, and it's really just me being nitpicky, the fact that I didn't get 5 stars, but I do think it was just a tad bit long and there were parts that I think could have been edited down. So that's again just me being really nitpicky. Apart from that, this is a fantastic horror novel and I really, really recommend it. Okay, the next 2 books that I read were the first 2 volumes in a manga series called The Flowers of Evil by Shuzo Oshimi. I've talked about Shuzo Oshimi a couple times on this channel, but mostly in the context of discussing Blood on the Tracks, which is a series of his that I really love and really enjoy. So this is an older series about a middle school boy who has a crush on a girl and kind of does something on impulse without really thinking, but it's something sort of embarrassing. And one of his other classmates witnesses him doing this, and she ends up blackmailing him and sort of holding this over his head to control him and get him to do some things. So this was, I think, pretty good, but I just prefer Blood on the Tracks. I mean, I ended up giving this 3.25 out of 5 stars. I'm not like dying to finish the series, but I do think that this is a worthwhile read because Shuzo Oshimi's art is just inherently beautiful and creepy and amazing. So if I get some free time and I, get the urge to, I might continue to get the volumes from my local library, but I just have so many other things on my TBR that I think I would rather read. So for now, I think I'm going to kind of just put a pause on the series. That's not to say you shouldn't read it, but I just wasn't like super blown away by this. The next thing I read was Orochi Blood by Kazuo Umezu. I was really stoked to be able to find this vintage copy from my library because it's just got the cool cover. Viz recently released a new Orochi like story collection, and the cover looked really cool, and I know that he's a really big influence on Junji Ito, and I'm obviously a big Junji Ito fan. So I've been meaning to read more of his work. I thought, hey, let me read, at least one of the stories before I buy the, story collection, even though I was pretty sure I would like it. This specific Orochi story is about a tale of two sisters. One of them is sort of like the perfect one, and then the younger one just like can't do anything right and is constantly scolded by their family. And then there's Orochi, who is this female character who kind of watches over the sisters over the course of their lives and then ends up saving one of the sisters from a car accident before mysteriously kind of falling into a coma for decades. And then when she reawakens, she reconnects with the sisters and learns that her connection to the sisters is a little bit more mysterious than even she originally understood. I think if you go into this knowing as little as possible, like, you'll enjoy it. If you like horror manga, you're gonna like this. If you like Junji Ito, you're gonna like this. I mean, even just from the first page you open up to, it's just like, yeah, I'm gonna like this. I'm gonna be fine. Just some creepy stuff. I love the old school look. This was just amazing, and I definitely want to start buying some more Orochi volumes and probably the new compilation that was just released. Now I see why Kazuo Umezu is considered a horror master, and yeah, I gave it 5 out of 5 stars. All right, next I read Nothing Can Hurt You by Nicola Maye Goldberg, and I didn't really know a lot about this before I read it, and I was pleasantly surprised. So the synopsis is that a college student, Sarah Morgan, is killed, and her boyfriend pleads guilty, and he's able to basically get off on like temporary insanity. So he goes to like rehab or something, but then is pretty much able to live out the rest of his life pretty normally. The novel is really unique in that each chapter is a vignette of a different character who is somehow affected or impacted by the death of Sarah Morgan. And I thought it was really interesting because each chapter, it starts out and it tells you who like the point of view is from, but it's not immediately clear how they're connected to Sarah or how they were impacted by the death. So it was kind of interesting. Like, each chapter was its own little mystery. Like, you had to like look at the clues and figure out like, okay, that's how they were connected. Some of the point of views, it was like people who were so far removed from the violent act. So it was interesting to see how a single violent act can have such a butterfly effect and ripple out to people far beyond what you would think. Yeah, just someone who maybe met Sarah once or didn't even meet her and just discovered her dead body and like stuff like that. I actually ended up reading this in a single sitting. It had such an amazing page-turning pace, and I was just so captivated by it. In hindsight, I read this sort of at the beginning of the month, and when I was like trying to like write down my thoughts of what I had about this book, I couldn't really remember a lot about this book. And it's not because it was forgettable, but I do think it was because I just sat down and devoured it in a single sitting without really savoring it. But I have not been able to stop thinking about this book, so I really do want to buy a copy for my personal collection and reread it one day, because it blew me away. When I first finished it, I was like maybe like 4.25, 4.5 stars. But since I just haven't been able to stop thinking about it, and I just can't really fault it. I just enjoyed every aspect of it. I was like, you know what? We're gonna give it a 5. We're giving it a 5. And that's kind of a big deal for me. I feel like I'm kind of stingy with my 5s, but I'm giving it a 5. All right, next I read Oona Out of Order. And this is one that is not really in my normal wheelhouse. But my sister read it and said it was her favorite book of 2021. But my sister reads books that are thematically quite different from what I enjoy. So I don't know. Either way, I still went in with kind of high hopes, but I ended up being kind of disappointed by this one. Oona Out of Order is a book about a woman who, on the eve of her, I think 19th birthday, she, like when the clock strikes midnight, the next moment she wakes up and she's like in her 52-year-old body, but she's like mentally 19. And that's when she learns that each year she's basically going to live out a different year of her life. So rather than living out her life sequentially from like 1 to 100 or whatever, she's going to like skip around and live her life out of order. So I think the concept of this is really interesting. It sounds like it's kind of sci-fi, but it really isn't. It really is more like contemporary modern fiction, because it doesn't really go into the nitty-gritty details of like, this is how we're time traveling, or, you know. It is more about her having to deal with this reality and kind of just like still live out the happiest life she possibly can. I went into this with high hopes, but I just think I kind of set myself up to fail. This just isn't really a book for me. I think if you enjoy romance and like happy, lighthearted stories, you'll really like this. And that's not to say that it's just like her whole life is like sunshine and roses, because obviously there's a lot of conflict that comes from her condition. I just need like darker themes. That's not to say that I'm like completely immune to wholesome content, but I'm just a lot harder on it because it's not as interesting to me. Yes, I gave it 2 out of 5 stars, but I really don't think you should take my opinion as like whether you should read this or not. Unless you have a similar reading taste to me, then you probably shouldn't. The next thing I read was something a little odd, but just bear with me. So it was a short story that was an Easter egg from a video game. The video game is Doki Doki Literature Club, and this is a game that my partner and I played through maybe like 6 months ago. And I think it's the most disturbing game I've ever played. It really messed me up. It is basically marketed as a dating sim or like a visual novel type game. But then as you play, it sort of devolves into something more sinister, and you realize that things are not quite as they seem. So I'm being kind of vague because I think if you're interested, you should just go check it out for yourself. It is free on Steam right now, I think, so check it out. But anyway, even if you haven't played the game and you want to, I would say you probably could read the story because the story is completely unrelated. It is just like a little Easter egg that the developer wrote and included in the game. But the story has nothing to do with the game. It's not going to spoil the game at all. On the flip side, if you haven't played the game, haven't heard of it, don't care about the game, you also don't need to have knowledge about the game in order to enjoy the story. They are pretty separate. It just so happens that in order to get access to the story, you needed to like put one of the character files into like a code converter, and then when you do that, it converts into the story. So anyway, I'm gonna include a link below for the story if you're interested in it, because that's already been decoded and it's free to read online now. So I will include the link in the description. But the story is called The Linda Watson Story, and it is about a college-age woman who is curious about what it would be like to kill someone. And the entire story is basically her exploring that curiosity. My partner is the one who originally heard of it after we had played the game. He read it and was like, this kind of messed me up. And I was like, sign me up. It definitely had a creepypasta vibe to it. If you know my reading style, you know I love me a good creepypasta. So it is a pretty short read. It was really good. I gave it 5 out of 5 stars. I have saved the link so that I can revisit it if I want to, because I thought it was really creepy and really good. And I think you should read it. Oh boy, okay. The next thing I read is a pretty beloved book in like every sector of bookish internet spaces. So I'm a little worried to talk about this because I didn't really like it that much. But the next book I read was Dark Matter by Blake Crouch. This is a sci-fi thriller novel. I had to take a drink for courage. This book follows main character Jason Dessen, and he is abducted one night on his way home. And the last thing he hears his abductor say is, "Are you happy with your life?" before he is then knocked out. And then he wakes up. It seems like he's been transported into a life that is not actually his. Like his wife is not his wife. His son has not even been born. His colleagues are completely different. And instead of being a community college physics professor, he's now this like highly lauded genius, like physics genius. The whole book is him trying to figure out like, what's going on? Am I insane? I just want to get back to my family. So yeah, I had high hopes for this. The premise was pretty intriguing to me. I guess I shouldn't say I love a sci-fi thriller, but science is very interesting to me, as you know, I am a scientist. I really didn't relate to any of the characters. And without like spoiling the story, I guess I specifically really couldn't relate to the main character and like the main character's driving force. This character's identity pretty much boils down to, I love my wife more than anything. And I get that some people might think that that's like heroic and romantic, but that kind of thing is just unrealistic to me and doesn't really warm my cold, dead heart. Instead of moving me or making me feel connected to the character, it kind of just made the character seem really one-dimensional and almost like an idealized caricature of what a husband should be. I will say this book was thought-provoking because I discussed it with a friend who has also read it and she really loved it. And it really made me think about like what lengths I would go to if I found myself in this situation. But at the end of the day, I just really couldn't connect to the main character because he just felt too idealized and he didn't feel realistic to me. So I gave it 2 out of 5 stars. Next, I read Almond by Won Pyung-Sohn. This is about a boy who has a brain condition where he can't process or feel emotions how most humans can. And he doesn't really have friends, but his grandmother and mother aren't really fazed by his condition and just try to teach him how to like act out emotions. Okay, when this sort of thing happens, this is how you should pretend to act. And you know, he really isn't malicious or like malevolent, and he really does just want to try and like live a normal life. He isn't your typical like psychopath character, which I really enjoyed. So the main character basically grows up relatively content with his mother and grandmother, but then there is a tragic event which isolates Yoon-jae, and he's sort of left to his own devices and has to kind of figure things out a little bit more on his own. And he kind of acknowledges that he's a monster, or, you know, he's someone who would be labeled as a monster by society. But again, he just really wants to live a peaceful, normal life. And then he comes across a bully at school who is just like really troubled, and they end up changing each other in unexpected ways. I read this in my first thesis writing vlog, and I kind of shared some thoughts on it while I was reading it. What I really enjoyed about this book is that Yoon-jae, even though he is sort of like set up as this like psychopath in the making, he really wasn't a malevolent character. He really was just like a normal teenage boy who was trying to just live his best life and just like live a peaceful, quiet life. And I think his struggle with like wanting to process emotions normally, it wasn't because he wanted to for himself. It was like he knew that would make him more normal and like enable him to live that peaceful life he was really wanting. This novel really makes you think about what it means to actually be a monster, and especially when the two boys come together. So Yoon-jae, the main character, and then the school bully. It's like these two boys have been labeled by society as monsters for two separate reasons, and it's interesting how them coming together, they teach each other these unexpected things, and they really challenge what it means to be a monster and what does a monster look like. I will say I wasn't the hugest fan of how this ended. This is definitely, it's not a horror story, it really is more of a coming of age story. And while I did enjoy that Yoon-jae was a more wholesome exploration of this psychopath in the making, I did think that the ending kind of towed the line over into like being maybe a little bit too cheesy. But honestly, that's just me being a nitpicky, cynical person. I still think this is a fantastic book. I ended up giving it 4 out of 5 stars, and I think you should read it. Next, I read The Woman in the Window by AJ Finn. This was a pretty buzzy thriller about a woman who, she is agoraphobic. She stays in her home and she basically drinks wine, watches old movies, and spies on her neighbors. And when she witnesses an act of violence and goes to the police, that's what sort of kicks off the novel and sort of this descent into what's real, what's actually happening, another like questioning of reality. So I think it's like a pretty good setup for a thriller, but I was pretty disappointed by this. And I think what it boils down to is that the novel had really bad pacing. It started out really strong, I was invested, but then I was able to guess a pretty big twist quite early on. And so whenever I'm able to guess something, it's like whatever point I'm at, it's just like, okay, this is what's going to happen. And then I'm just like waiting for it to happen. And then if it doesn't happen, if something subverts my expectations, I'm like, okay, cool, I like that. But then if I'm just like waiting for like what I expect to happen, and then it happens, I'm just like, okay, great, we made it to that checkpoint, now what? It's kind of just like a slog to get through. So that definitely decreased my enjoyment quite a bit. I will say I was not able to guess the ending though. Did not guess it. Did enjoy that. But again, back to pacing, it's like when this author makes these big reveals and it's like supposed to be this shocking twist, it's like the author then takes so long. It just like, he drags it out. And then it's just like, it becomes boring. So it's like, oh my God, shocking twist. And then you just like have to like get through this whole like long freaking scene that really needed to be edited down. So I gave it 3 out of 5 stars. Sorry if you liked it. The next thing I read was With Teeth by Kristen Arnett, and I did a reading vlog on this one in my thesis writing vlog 2. And all of my like reading vlogs are non-spoiler unless I explicitly say so in the vlog. So if you want to know more about my thoughts as I'm reading it. But basically this follows main character Sammy as she navigates motherhood. Basically she is kind of afraid of her son, and he's like really sullen and a troublemaker, and she just really feels like she doesn't like him. She loves her son, but she doesn't like him. The whole story is about like her growing resentment for her son and her wife, and sort of like how fragile the fabric of family is and the many ways in which it can be torn. This is the first book that I've read in a long time where it starting out I was like, yeah, this is probably like a 3.5 star read. But then as it progressed, I just liked it more and more. And now in hindsight, it's like, man, that was really good. I now want to get a physical copy and annotate it because there were just so many lines that were really thought-provoking for me. It explores a lot of really interesting anxieties about motherhood, which were intriguing to me. I started out thinking I would relate quite a bit to the main character, but then I was really impressed by how connected I felt to all of the other characters as well. I also really love morally great characters. In the beginning, when a character would do something bad, I was like, okay, they're the villain. Got it. I'm smart. We're good. But then you would see a different character do something bad, and it was like, okay, maybe it's not so simple. And then basically you got to see like all of these characters in their flaws, and they just felt very realistic. And I liked this idea of, it started out and you're like, okay, you're the bad guy, you're the cause of this is why everyone's miserable. But then when everyone else would you would see the faults of everyone else, it kind of became this like chicken and egg situation where it was like, which came first? Like who started this? And sort of this like cycle of misery begetting misery. And I really liked exploring that ambiguity. I really enjoyed following these characters over the course of the story and was really surprised by how much my feelings for each of the characters changed over the course of the story. Each chapter ended with a short POV from like an ancillary character. It was kind of a nice little peek into what was really happening, because obviously we're mostly from the point of view of Sammy, the mother. And as you're getting to know the mother-son dynamic better and better, obviously you're only getting the one-sided view of it. So it was interesting to get different characters' perspectives to get a better idea of like, okay, what is this relationship actually like? So yeah, if you had asked me at the beginning if this was one that I would want to purchase for my personal collection, I most assuredly would have said no, but here we are. I would like to purchase it and I would like to annotate it. I ended up giving it 4.5 out of 5 stars, and I think you should read it. Next, I read Ghost Wall by Sarah Moss, and this was kind of a different type of story than one I've ever read. So this follows Sylvie, who is a high school girl who goes on this sort of like anthropology trip with her parents. And they basically go on this trip with an anthropology college class. Her dad is the one who wants to go because he's like obsessed with ancient Britain and the Iron Age. So they all go to this sort of like the wilderness of northern Britain and live as if they're living in the Iron Age. And Sylvie's life juxtaposes with that of the college students, and mixing and mingling with the college students makes Sylvie realize new possibilities for her future. You know, there's this like rising tension. It sort of almost had like a Lord of the Flies feel, how like Lord of the Flies, like the tension just builds until it bursts into this act of violence. And that's a really similar experience, I would say, here. But I definitely loved that even though like the tension was there and there was a sense of something building, I never could guess like, okay, what is going to happen? And I wasn't able to guess the ending at all. And yeah, I really liked this one, and I will be nabbing a copy of this at my used bookstore when I see it. So I gave it 3.75 out of 5 stars. Next, I read In the Miso Soup by Ryo Murakami. I had read Audition in January. Didn't really like the narrator in that one, so I wasn't really sure if I would like this one. But pleased to tell you that I did like it. This is about an American tourist named Frank who travels to Japan to check out the red light district. And he hires a tour guide named Kenji who takes him around the red light district to do different taboo things. Kenji seems like he's not really sure how to take Frank. Basically, immediately Kenji realizes there's something not right with Frank, but he's not quite able to put his finger on it. Over the course of the 3 nights, we learn more and more about Frank. We learn more and more about Kenji. I was really pleasantly surprised by this. I really enjoyed this. I ended up reading this cover to cover on a flight to Phoenix, and it was really enjoyable to read it all in one sitting. I liked this way better than Audition, and I thought that the antagonist was really satisfyingly creepy. This was a wild ride, but it was also pretty unexpected. You know, when you think of like, okay, American tourist goes through red light district, you probably have like some idea of like, okay, this is probably what's going to happen. What I had in my box of this is what's going to happen, none of that happened. So I really enjoyed that it was an unexpected wild ride. Murakami is just such a master at building tension, so you're always like on the edge and like you always have this feeling of like, okay, I know something is going to happen, but I don't know what that is, and I don't know when it's going to happen. So you're constantly just like, oh my God, what's going to happen? What's going to happen? And it's just, I just love it. Another one that I will definitely be nabbing a copy of when I see it out in the wild. So yes, I gave it 4.5 out of 5 stars, and I think you should read it. If you didn't like Audition, but you haven't read any other Murakami, definitely try this one out. Okay, next I read Diary of an Oxygen Thief by Anonymous, and this is another pretty buzzy book that has, you know, saturated every corner of the book internet. So this is purported to be an autobiography, and it begins with a narrator who emotionally abused a lot of women for fun, but he realized he had a problem with alcohol. He went to AA, got sober, and now he's writing this in hindsight with some sort of degree of remorse. And he's looking back and he's like, basically miserable now. This was pretty buzzy, but it was also a pretty divisive book. I ended up really liking it. This is another one I read cover to cover on my trip to Phoenix while I was actually on my way back from Phoenix, and it was really fun to read in one sitting. I can definitely see why people wouldn't like it, because the main character emotionally abuses women. He explains it in like excruciating detail and like how much he enjoys it. And like now it's like, when you hear about him being like, oh, I'm like so sorry and I'm like so remorseful and I'm like miserable now, I can see how some people would be like, fuck you, dude. You don't deserve, you suck. Like, why? I don't, you know, so I could see why some people would not like it. And I will say, I did not at any point feel bad for him. Don't misconstrue my enjoyment of the book as me feeling bad for him or feeling sorry for him, because he is a garbage pile of a man. But I don't think this book was ever trying to actually get the reader on his side, so to speak. I think what I enjoyed about it is that it set it up. It's like, okay, here's this garbage pile of a man, okay? And now he's miserable. So for me, it was like this feeling of like schadenfreude. I was just like really enjoying hearing about this guy who sucks, who objectively sucks, being miserable. So I don't know what that says about me, but take it up with my therapist. So yeah, I gave it 4.25 out of 5 stars. I think that there's a sequel. It's like something with a chameleon in the name, and I want to read that. I will be reading that. Okay, and the last thing I read was In the Dream House by Carmen Maria Machado. This is one that I listened to on audiobook, and it is a memoir about the author's years of being in a same-sex relationship, which featured quite a bit of domestic violence. In addition to being a really interesting memoir, it was also really informative about the history of domestic violence in queer relationships. Machado is a very gifted storyteller, and this is objectively exquisitely written. I loved how she played with form and put her own spin on the memoir. And it was really interesting how she used a lot of themes of horror and horror tropes to tell her story. It was just a really, really unique memoir. I listened to this on audiobook and it was read by the author, which was really cool. This is a book that I really, really liked, but it wasn't like 5 stars for me. I think this is like an objectively 5-star book. The writing is amazing. It's a great memoir. But yeah, I can't give it a subjective 5 stars. So I ended up giving it 4 out of 5 stars. But that's not to say that I won't pick up a physical copy. I think if I do see, like if I see a copy in like a used bookstore, I could see this being one that I would add to my collection, but I don't know if I ever need to read it again. So yeah, that's everything I read in April. I don't remember months because my brain is dead. I'm gonna have a Phoenix travel reading vlog coming out next, so keep an eye out for that. Thank you for watching. Okay, bye.